My name is Blair Robbins, and I am the chair of the Cherokee Garden Library Advisory Board. I'm so pleased that you could all join us this evening for the showing of a new film, Landscapes of Exclusion, produced by our partner organization, the Library of American Landscape History. Following the short documentary, we look forward to a panel discussion featuring Arthur J. Clement, William E. O'Brien, and Ian Forster. Abra Lee will serve as moderator. Ms. Lee is a horticulturist, historian, author, founder of Conquer the Soil, and member, fortunately for us, of the Cherokee Garden Library Advisory Board. Ms. Lee will introduce our panelists following the film. For those of you joining us for the first time, I'd like to share a little background information about the Cherokee Garden Library. The library was established in 1975 by the Cherokee Garden Club here in Atlanta. The library is named for the Cherokee rose, the state flower of Georgia. The Cherokee Garden Library is one of the special collection libraries of the Keenan Research Center at the Atlanta History Center. The library collects and preserves books, periodicals, manuscript collections, and visual arts collections ranging from the 16th century to the present. These collections tell the diverse and fascinating stories of horticulture and botanical history in the southeastern United States and in areas of influence throughout the world. The Cherokee Garden Library is closely connected to the History Center's Goisweta Gardens, a remarkable 33-acre green space. If you have never visited the gardens, please do. And if you have visited many times before, please come back. There is always something new to discover and explore in the Goisweta Gardens. The professional staff of the library and the gardens are here this evening and would love to answer your questions during the reception. In closing, I'd like to thank our sponsors this evening, including our lead sponsor, Arbormatics, and our sponsors, Pond & Company, Linda and Hank Harris, and Dale Yeager. Thank you also to our generous patrons whose names are listed on a display board in the atrium. I'd also like to thank my co-chair for this evening, Melissa Wright, and our very talented floral designers, Elise Drake and Mary Moore. And finally, I'd like to thank each one of you for attending the program tonight. The film will begin in just a moment.
Well, we are all so excited to be here with you today. Stacy, thank you for the warm introduction you gave me earlier. And I wanted to introduce the audience to the gentleman of the hour today. This is, to my right, William E. O'Brien, who is the author of Landscapes of Exclusion and also the professor of environmental studies at Florida Atlantic University in Florida. And y'all, my godparents are sitting right there, so hi, Dr. and Mrs. Gully. It's just throwing me off. So sorry, I have to say that, and I'm just tickled to see them. Also, Ian Forster, who is a filmmaker, producer, and director, and who produced this beautiful film to tell this wonderful history. So happy to have you here today from Brooklyn, by way of Pennsylvania. And the hero, the movie star, Arthur J. Clement, who is an architect, preservationist architect, and also an independent historian of historic Black green spaces. So thank y'all for having us here today. And Ian, I want to start with you. What appealed to you about this specific project? You're young, you live in Brooklyn, you're from Pennsylvania, this is about the Jim Crow South, so
Sure.
How did you get involved? What was your interest here?
Yeah, so I have a full-time job actually making art documentaries at a nonprofit called Art 21, and I still work there. And so I was interested in making work outside of that. And so I got connected with the Library of American Landscape History, and we were in touch for a few years, deciding on what project to undertake. They had made a few films on their previous books, about I think 5 or 6 films, and they're hoping to restart that project. So in looking at their catalog of books to perhaps turn into a film like this, the Landscapes of Exclusion book just kind of rose to the top out of that process. And so it was initially published in 2015, and so then we began filming about 2 years ago. We really began the process in earnest. And yeah, it's coming from making art documentaries to this was a little intimidating, I think, at first, because history, you want to get it right. You know, I know it is always a little subjective, but you know, you want to get the facts correct. But thinking about parks as culturally constructed things, I think was really useful for me, because that's obviously art reflects the time it's made in and the people who made it. And so parks are very much in that same vein. So kind of coming to it from that perspective, I gave myself permission to take on this project to a degree. But the LALH really connected us all. So obviously, Bill wrote the book, and Art had written for them as well independently. So they kind of knew that Art had this experience. They kind of did some matchmaking. But yeah, no, I grew up going to state parks constantly. My sister is an environmental educator at a state park in Pennsylvania, so they're very near and dear to me. And then we bonded about our Eagle Scout experiences. So yeah, it just kind of blossomed from there, I'd say.
Very cool. And the next question is for you, Bill. So many documentation, discussion, papers, books about parks are written from the angle and lens of environmentalism or health or the outdoor experience, and you chose to write your book from the historical and political lens. And tell us about that process and why you decided to flip it and just really focus on the history and the backstory and the series of events that led to the desegregation, along with the segregation and desegregation of state parks.
So I came across this project in, I don't know, maybe 2005, maybe even earlier. And the kind of the political angle really fell into my lap. I was in the Florida State Archives doing research on something else, and I found this article from the Southern Regional Council, which was an Atlanta-based organization aimed at desegregation in the early 1950s. And basically, they had written an article arguing that state park segregation was unconstitutional. And I was really intrigued, and I went back and I started to do some other research, and I found that no one had really talked about it at all. And the idea that the 14th Amendment focused on kind of equal protection, and you think about like Brown versus Board of Education and schools, well, at least there were schools. With parks, there was really nothing available at all. And it was a very, very, very kind of challenging process for the establishment of state parks around the South. We talk about how the National Park Service was really kind of taking the lead and trying to push for that. But the Southern officials, Southern agencies were very, very, very resistant. But it took a number of years, a number of court cases, really commencing after World War II, and so we see the culmination in 1955 of the Supreme Court basically saying that state park segregation was unconstitutional, and then events kind of unfolded from there. But my own process of research was very, very painstaking, very time-consuming. There was really nothing written about it, so it took me a really long time to travel all around the states of the South to libraries and archives and just really kind of hunting down information to put together this book, because no one had really talked about it. And I think what you said in the beginning about how people tend to think about parks as environmental and kind of think about the ecology, there really just wasn't really much out there about these parks. State parks in particular, because no one really writes about state parks. They write about national parks. But this was a really kind of intriguing topic that no one had explored, so I was really fortunate to kind of come into it that way.
Well, certainly congratulations to you. This is such a enlightening and informing book, and you connect so many of the dots of American history to state park history and Black communities. So thank you for doing that. And now I have a question for Art, the hero of the story. And I want to talk to you about the film, specifically Black Joy. And there's a few things. One, you say in the film, I remember those days fondly when I think about my childhood, when you're referencing Reedy Creek State Park in North Carolina. And in your book, you talk about these, in reference to the Black families and communities that come to these parks. It says they came by car, taxi, truck, and trailers with church pews, which I thought was really very, very Black to bring the church pews into the parks. And with this, despite the political climate that's going on, what do you think is driving this excitement of Black communities coming into these parks? And speak about your experience at Reedy Creek and what I'll let you answer that first, and then I have a follow-up question to that. I don't want to make it too long to make you forget.
Well, let me say this, Reedy Creek Park was a park, and we would go there occasionally, you know, for activities, and that was a day trip. But in the film, I was talking about my experience as a Boy Scout, going there for a week or two, you know, earning merit badges, and I went with my brother. I had 2 older brothers. And so when I was talking to them in preparation for this film, I mean, we all had these great stories and experiences going down and learning to swim and boat and canoe. And we never thought about these spaces as spaces of exclusion or segregation. I mean, we went there and just had a great time. And we had some church picnics that we went to there and so forth. I mean, the other part of Reedy Creek. Whispering Pines was just a small area of Reedy Creek. And so that experience was very important to my childhood. The fact that we could go to these parks in Durham, in the Raleigh-Durham area. The park was in between the 2 cities. And therefore it became a place where we could go outside and have some fun and so forth. So in my mind, that's the reference point about these parks. And then secondarily, as a Boy Scout camp, the Boy Scouts were segregated at that time, and so we couldn't go to the parks for the white Scouts. But nonetheless, we were able to progress and you know, go achieve rank and go for, you know, rise up. And my brothers, 2 brothers and I, we all became Eagle Scouts. And so that was very important in terms of sense of achievement and, you know, having mastery of certain skills. So these parks afforded, you know, my family those opportunities. That wasn't the case in a lot of other towns and cities in North Carolina. Folks just didn't have access. So in that sense, you know, the fact that we were not disadvantaged by not having a park, therefore I didn't have that sense of loss. I had this sense of abundance, I guess, as my wife would say, that, you know, it was a wonderful thing, a wonderful experience. But it's interesting, I happened to see the book when it was coming out. I had submitted a piece to the Library of American History, and I saw this park and this picture of these boys and I said, I know that camp. And so I explained that to her. And so when they decided, this is Robin Carson, when they decided to do the film, an educational film as a companion to the book, she put Ian and I together, and we talked about getting together. And so, you know, lo and behold, we went and shot, and it, you know, became part of the movie. So that's how that came together.
Yeah,
Did you have something you wanted to add, Ian?
Yeah, I think showcasing the positive experience was so important, just to illuminate or make evident the value that these parks have, quite simply. But taking the story for a documentary context, it's a visual medium, so we have to show things. So it's a complicated thing we have to explain, like to show these parks, but then explain soon thereafter that that was rare. And then, because it's an absence, there was an absence that we had to kind of visualize. So finding those 2 examples that we chose to film, so the second one being Lake Murray State Park, that could show the quality difference, but then also the qualitative difference, or the quantitative difference between the parks as well.
Absolutely. And this next question is joint for Bill and Art. Art, you as an architect, preservation architect, as an independent historian, for those in the room who may not know, and Bill, you write about this, Black segregated parks that are built, even within this state of Georgia, or other parts of this. Please talk about those and what people may not know about these parks. So for instance, Bartow Carver Park. I do work in Black garden history and research that. I had no idea that there was a George Washington Carver State Park in Georgia at one point. So could you just talk about that history and how these parks disappear and what actually happens?
Yeah, the Georgia parks really came about at the point where the NAACP really started pushing for equality and started filing lawsuits, and it really caused the state park systems all around the South to really kind of wake up and say, we got to do something. We have to pretend at least that we're promoting a separate but equal standard. And so all the Georgia parks came to be after 1950. And it was ironically really kind of the biggest era of the development of segregated parks. During the New Deal, there weren't really that many created just because there was so much resistance in the South, but now this kind of threat that was looming really kind of pushed the agenda forward. And so they ended up, I think it was 6 parks in Georgia. Some of them were the dual use kind, where like Fort Yargo would have like a really big area for white visitors and a very small area for black visitors. There was the Carver Park in Alatoona. It wasn't part of the Alatoona State Red Top Mountain State Park, but it was kind of separated. Now it's Bartow Carver. It was really kind of a desperate effort that was doomed to failure, because by the early 1950s, the court system, the lawsuits were basically indicating that separate but equal was going to kind of fall pretty soon, and it fell with the Brown versus Board decision. So there was a kind of a last gasp effort to really kind of put these parks in place, and Georgia was part of that.
The other thing I would say is that I know Bill had a chance to look at the different parks, the white parks and the black parks, and I'm sure there are differences you can discern in terms of the construction. But for us as young kids, they were all rustic. You had this sort of rough cut lump timber and the stone chimneys and things we all remember. But for me, that was just, the way the camps were. I'm sure there were differences in the lakes and the docks and the amount of canoes and so forth. But the thing that I think that is a takeaway for me is that when we went back to Reedy Creek, there was no signage. There was nothing talking about the history of the park. And Reedy Creek was what Bill called a dual-purpose park, a dual-use park, in which the federal government had given this land, over 5,000 acres, Crabtree Park, and then they created one section for whites. That was predominantly most of the park. And then Reedy Creek was backed up against it, and that was a small black park. But now, it's been renamed. It's called Umstead Park. It's run by the state. And you go through there, and there's no signage. There's no sense of history or interpretation. And I think that's a big loss in talking about these parks and how they existed. And so you go over to the main park. I think, Ian, you went there, and they just have like a one blurb that, something about segregation.
Yeah, there's a beautiful room with the history of the area in the park, but in the timeline, it's a very small section. I forget exactly how they phrased it. It could be expanded upon greatly, and especially and you still enter they're not connected still to this day, and they probably never will just because of the landscape. Everyone obviously can use both halves now, but it's evidence that there's different entrances. You can't get to the other side without leaving the park and going around the airport, and if you go that way, it's quite difficult to get to the two different sides.
That was
people just don't know. Yeah.
I'm sorry, excuse me. That was a real strategy of design too. It's like, how do we keep the campers separate in these dual-use parks? And usually it was an expansive forest, something big enough that the campers can't hike through and kind of get to the other side. A lot of white parents are really concerned that their kids were going to be in this situation where you'd have this race mixing. And so the designers really went to great lengths to really make sure there was very significant separation. Sometimes it was forest, sometimes it was bodies of water, like a big lake, and you put one park on the one side, you put one park on the other side. But it was very deliberate design strategies. And to me, that was, as someone who looks at landscape and architecture of landscapes, it was a really, really kind of just fascinating, look at how this discrimination is really etched in the landscape. Like, it's not even kind of, it's there for everyone to see if they're willing to look. And like I said, there really hasn't been much interpretation, and there's a lot of room for really kind of fleshing that out and really telling people about it.
And I want to speak to, I know there are a lot of people that work in parks and public spaces in the audience today, and we're talking about state parks, but what I noticed in your book on page 133, I found what I feel is an Easter egg, and it is homes versus the city of Atlanta. And I said, ooh, I know what this might be about. And I wanted to bring it home to not state parks being so distant, but what we could do in our local communities. So this ties two sides of Atlanta, which always exists, the Southwest Atlanta, the black side, the white side. It's always been this tale of two cities per se. In the case Homes versus the city of Atlanta, is Dr. Hamilton Holmes is refused entry to Bobby Jones Golf Course. And so his son, Tubb Holmes, they sue the city of Atlanta. And what is now is Tubb Holmes Golf Course in Southwest Atlanta and Adams Park, and Bobby Jones here. And you talk about interpretation. These things aren't discussed. What could Atlanta even do better to make sure that we document these type of histories? I mean, this is extraordinary. Tubb Holmes goes on to be the father of Hamilton Holmes, who integrates the University of Georgia. I mean, there's a real story. These aren't just anybody's. This is Atlanta, this is royalty, Black American royalty. So how do we get that on a sign so people can understand that and also understand Bobby Jones? So I grew up in Southwest Atlanta, but I went to North Atlanta in Buckhead. So I was on the golf team, surprise, surprise, my Easter egg. And I never knew this, and that was our home course. That's where we practiced, was Bobby Jones. Had no idea that Bobby Jones, this course triggered this whole chain of events for integration, even in public green spaces in golf in Atlanta.
Right. Well, state parks, national parks have been here. I think that's a major legacy, and I think it's one of the things that the landscape of the Library of American Landscape History really has advocated for, to understand the significance of parks and the history. And in many cases, unlike desegregation of schools, a lot of the Black schools are no longer present. Many of these parks and areas are still there. And so how can we retell those stories? And Stacy was telling me about their efforts to capture pictures and other events from there. And I mean, I've just never thought about that, doing that for parks. I mean, it's an important sense of who we are. And so I would hope that all of us here today would think about that. And how can we talk about those histories? Of course, there are Black resorts that we would go to summer after summer to the beach, American Beach in Jacksonville, Topsail Beach down in Wilmington, going up into the Sag Harbor area in Boston, Idlewild in Michigan. And so there were communities that were using these public areas summer after summer. The communities would go back and we'd have experiences and friends and things like that. So how can we capture that history and talk about it more in a way that we can appreciate this past?
Mm-hmm.
And to give some context to the audience, so when art is referenced in American Beach, and this is a Black beach founded by Abraham, he's Dr. Janetta Cole, who's the former president of Spelman. Her grandfather purchases the land in
John L. Lewis.
Thank you. Outside of Jacksonville, Florida, to create this Black beach town and area, and it's thriving for this Black community. In Sag Harbor, not to go into more detail there, we have Amazily Meredith, who is credited as one of the first Black women architects, and is an artist and leads the art department at Virginia Union University, and designed Sag Harbor up in New York as a weekend home for many Black people. And her sister is the real estate agent there. So it's very important to document these spaces and talk about these stories, because otherwise people would just think it's just a beach. And I wanted to get back to your work in architecture and preservation. And you and I were having a side conversation about David Augustus Williston being the first Black landscape architect, laying out these spaces at Tuskegee. In contrast, you're describing these Black spaces being laid out in state parks by particularly probably white architects, white land planners. There's a stark contrast of how Black men, Black people are laying out HBCUs and those beautiful spaces versus these very minimalist spaces they're creating. So would you speak to that and the importance of even Black involvement in creating Black green spaces and the differences that are created there, the energy, the interaction?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think there are 2 points of view on that. The design, there were opportunities where Black landscape architects like Williston and others were given an opportunity, not often, but the other part that I like to take apart is that how these spaces were used by African American families and so forth. And the times that they got together, the food, the gatherings, the telling of stories. There was a way of shaping the space in terms of, ritual and after dinner or after having a meal together to talk about the experiences. And so I think, for African Americans who normally have not gotten into formal credentials about being a landscape architect or a licensed architect, it still didn't mean that they couldn't shape or influence these spaces. And so it's just, I think you have to point out there were differences in the construction, but the use of those spaces, in those cabins, those are really small. That was the thing I noticed when I went back, how small these cabins were. But we had 6 or 7 people there in double bunks, and you would be telling stories and staying up at night, or it was just a camp experience. And so I'm glad that I had a chance to have that experience, and hopefully it could be something that we can continue to celebrate.
And I would add, in terms of the design of the parks, like you mentioned, it's really white architects who are producing these spaces, and they relied very directly on stereotypes to do that. So the idea was that the typical park, like I said in the film, was basically a small space, just a ball field, maybe a swimming pool, whatever it might be. And then, the stereotype was that, that's all we need for Black park visitors, whereas the white visitors would need like the big kind of vistas and the kind of the hiking trails and just the bigger opportunity spaces. And so they used that as an excuse to basically, kind of create inferior spaces for the Black visitors. So that was built into the whole kind of design feature.
And I think, too, bringing it back locally to the city of Atlanta, I'm thinking about my grandfather's neighborhood, built in 1940, Washington Park, and there being a Booker T. Washington Park there. And I never thought about this, but it really was, there's a natatorium there now, so there's a big swimming area. But in my childhood, it really was trees and park benches. In contrast to the neighborhood I grew up in, 10 minutes away, Adams Park is also built in 1940, and there's stone, and there's a lake in the park, and there's 2 natural waterfalls, and there's tennis courts and a golf course across the street. And I was thinking, this certainly wasn't built for Black folks. And so it's very interesting to see, even within the city park system, the minimalism that exists in the Black neighborhoods. So, what was built for Black spaces versus what was built for the white neighborhoods. And Ian, I want to come back to you. What would you have liked, 15 minutes, you did an incredible job, by the way. What would you have liked to include in this film that we didn't get to see?
Sure. Yeah, the editing process from the beginning was a big undertaking. I quite literally found comparable films and looked at how many words were in them. I think it was like 1,600 words, and then I counted the words in the book, and I was like, oh God, we have so much to trim down. And it was a daunting task to kind of focus it down to a story that's digestible, but without missing too much. But the story about spaces that were created by Black people for themselves, I think, was a really important story that is illuminated in the book. But we weren't able to include that. So it's just such an important history of not waiting for the government. And there you found texts using the stereotype of like, oh, they don't want park spaces, they don't want outdoor experiences. But that was not true, clearly, because they're doing it on their own without the government creating these spaces for themselves. And that's just an important history that I wish we could have illuminated as further, but just to keep it more squarely focused on state parks is just one. So that's why you should buy the book afterwards and read the whole thing.
For sure. And I'm going to do one final question here, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And this is for everyone to answer. And Art, I would love for you to have the last word. What can people do to reclaim this history of parks and the Black outdoor experience? What can we do, all of us, not just Black people? What can be done by people to make sure that this experience is reclaimed, stated? You talked about interpretation, but what can the everyday person do in an audience?
That's a big question. I mean, in doing this, I was just kind of reflecting back on my own experiences. Like, I also was in Boy Scouts and also, as I mentioned, went to state parks a lot. And I was just kind of reflecting back on my experience, and looking at who was there and why was it largely just white people in those spaces. And just kind of reflecting back and kind of understanding that history in my particular region, I think, was a useful exercise. So I don't know, just kind of thinking back to your own experiences and kind of digesting them and thinking about the causes, I think, is always a useful exercise.
Yeah, I think, the original question you asked earlier about, the separation between the nature and the society, and like, why do we look at things like that? I mean, the decisions to make parks are political decisions. These parks are constructed. They're a part of a process and they're part of a history. And, I think we all want to be more connected to history. I think it's really important for us to really account for the fullness of the history. And I think all of us can do more to really make some demands that those interpretation features become implemented and we rectify some of these issues.
Absolutely.
Well, I think, the state park system here in Georgia is really, there are quite a few state parks. I haven't been to all of them. And, when I was involved with Scouts with my sons, we went to many of the parks. And, that was a great experience. And I think to the extent that people can utilize their parks more and, advocate for, upgrading the parks and making sure that they are available. I mean, it's an vital part of who we are as a people. And when you go to other countries, you begin to see the differences that the resources devoted to parks may or may not be as prevalent. And so here we have these state parks, these open parks, and to the extent that we can really support them, I think is something we should all strive to do.
Is there anything that we didn't touch on that y'all would like to share before we take questions? Well, thank you for your time, and let's give them a round of applause again.
Hey, y'all. So we have time for 3 questions. If anybody has a burning question they absolutely have to ask, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. Okay, I see Mr. Landon.
Can you tell us, can you put this in the broader perspective of the whole United States and give us a sense of whether the issues that we've discussed existed nationally, or were they particularly and exclusively a Southern problem and challenge?
Yeah, my research didn't really extend beyond the southern states, but I did run into some documentation from other parts of the country. And generally the divide was that there was discrimination everywhere. And even in the north, there were parks that weren't necessarily officially segregated, but maybe there'd be one group using it at one time, a different group using it at a different time, but it wasn't kind of codified the way it was in the south. And I assumed that someone, and this is one of the hopes I had when I originally wrote the book, was that someone would look further into these issues, not just in the South, but elsewhere, to really try to figure out what was going on in other places. And I feel like there's a really rich history to uncover that just really we haven't even really scratched the surface of at this point.
I'd like to comment just as an anecdote. My wife, Elizabeth, who's here, grew up in California, and her family used to go to state parks, and she has great memories of Yellowstone and Half Dome and so forth. And so, they had an experience of going to parks without restriction, without reservation. And so that I think there were differences. With 50 states, of course, there's going to be differences. But in the West, where most of the parks are, I think they tended to be, more open and accommodating. Is, in the South, really, where you had this codification.
Okay, more hands. Anyone? Okay, yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Connie Smith-Lindsay, artist, good to see you. Look, I think that one of the words that we can look at more than anything when we look at parks is the fact that we're talking about Jim Crow. And whether we're looking at parks or we're looking at cemeteries or we're looking at neighborhoods, so what can we do? I think what you said a few minutes ago is, how do we leave here? And we all are a part of the solution. Because Jim Crow, as we know it then, and Jim Crow as it may be renamed today, still has a way of segregating us or bringing us together but still not being inclusive. So if you had your dream, if you could, give us all some dream dust and say, this is what this group is going to do when we leave here, what would that look like in Georgia, and what would that look like in our nation?
I would start by saying, toward the end of the film, Ian had inserted a discussion about this movement of Black Americans really trying to overcome the legacy of exclusion. And there was this very, white people tell you, you don't belong here, you don't belong here, you don't belong here, you eventually develop recreational activities somewhere else and do something else. And saying that, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to come to the national parks, we're going to come to the state parks, we're going to form organized groups that can take back these spaces, I think is something that's really, really important and pretty exciting, really.
I think anything we can do to intentionally, raise awareness about the parks, their availability, the fact that we can use them. We could even talk about stories in our own families of times we went together and spent together. I was talking to Stacy earlier, she was talking about collecting pictures. I was thinking about in our own family, we have pictures from times we were on trips together in parks, but we never seemed to prize, to hold those in the same esteem as our other experiences of family reunions and so forth. So I think that's raising awareness about the importance of parks. The fact that, Jim Crow is a legacy here and there are remnants of that should be, consideration. But, how do we use these spaces and do we make them available to everyone, I think is really important. And so that's what I would, try to raise awareness in that regard.
Sure. Yeah, I think in all of our lives, we all have different positions of power, I'd say, and I'd say thinking about those opportunities to share the power, I would say. I think in filmmaking, that's a big conversation, and in the hiring for this film, that was a big consideration, of course, and in terms of who I worked with, I think just inviting people to the table and giving opportunities at all times you're able to.
And I will add, I was talking to Art again prior to this, and I was talking about my day job as director of horticulture at Oakland Cemetery in downtown Atlanta. And we were talking about architecture and preservation. I said, oh, by the way, did you know there's about 3 headstones there that were made by Black funeral homes, and they're beautiful and they're handmade, and you can even see the handwritten letters in there. But it's almost like this hidden secret that we know within Oakland, but that should be on the interpretation, because this is in the historically Black section, made by Black people. No one is going into a Black green space. So certainly in my own work, holding ourselves accountable to not have these little tidbits that are fun facts within the team that works there, but people would love to know. People pass it every day and have no idea, and they're stunning. So certainly just, putting my money where my mouth is, and 6 months from now, because it'll take us time to fundraise for the sign, make sure we mark that at Oakland. So I'll commit to that.
Okay, we have time for one more question before we adjourn and have a reception and more conversation. Oh my goodness, this lady back here. Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm Corrine Dent, and I'm actually here with the Park Stewardship Academy with Park Pride. And I say that because the question I have is about grants. And I think the question might be directed to the moderator, but you're talking about doing, maybe fundraising for a sign or something for Oakland Cemetery. And do you know if there's grant funding to do like story walks to actually tell the history of parks, of state parks?
I will tell you, I know that I'm not as aware of parks grants, and I know that there's always money and grants out there. And I think about specifically a group called the Garden Conservancy, which is geared towards funding of historic garden spaces, including Black historic garden spaces. Most famously, they funded the restoration and to make sure that the garden is taken care of in perpetuity, the Ann Spencer Garden Museum in Lynchburg, Virginia. So because that kind of money exists, I would believe that there would be that money as well for parks. I don't know what group that is or what that would be, but let's talk afterwards and stay in touch, and we can figure it out together.
Okay, so let's give our brilliant panelist and our brilliant moderator a huge round of applause, please.
Thank you.
And just in closing, I'm so honored that all of you chose to come here tonight, and I'm very grateful for your presence. Please come enjoy hospitality with us, book signings by Bill, and also continued important conversations. Thank you so much for being here.